Okay. Okay, POIs through chat, please. I will say it here as well so people don't forget. I'll put it in the chat. Okay, great. Speech starting in 3, 2, 1. The largest losses we see in the Filipino people are not just because of failures of governments to make good decisions, but the failure of our government to make a decision in the first place. And it's often this time lag which leads to people dying, to more personal property being lost, and many of these things being very, very difficult to change because the average Filipino citizen has to pay the price of the government taking too long to be able to respond to these disasters. And that is why we generally prefer debureaucratization, because we think it is far better insofar as one, it streamlines the process in ensuring that these large disasters where time is of the essence are dealt with in ways that are better. But second, it is just far better in ensuring that people feel safer in their existence and feel like they can trust the government far more in comparison to the world that opposition has to defend. 3 points of framing then. One, what do these infrastructure projects look like? It looks like the expansion of sewage systems, the creation of seawalls, transplanting mangrove trees to strengthen the soil, or retrofitting buildings to prevent them from collapsing. And all of these things we'd like to note inherently mitigate the ways in which disasters can hurt us, which means that we think it just means on net you have less harm. But second, where and how do we save time? One, a lot of inefficiencies in bureaucratic networks exist in latent time and idle time and the fact that you have to ask many different offices. But two, for things that are obviously wrong, they will be spotted anyway because they will be obvious in either world. So it's unlikely to get the worst excess of it in regardless. But third, we would suggest it's about who is reviewing it. It shouldn't be multiple government officials who may not be very well versed in things like whether or not typhoons affect people in a scientific way, but those who are knowledgeable, Pag-asa, PhilVox, or LGUs who are far more close to their constituents and what really affects them with regards to infrastructure. The third point of framing is, absent bureaucracy, we would suggest there are inherent incentives for this to be done well. Insofar as one, there's just a lot more scrutiny, and the fact that in streamlining the process, you would remove all the people who may not be as relevant and keep those whose decisions actually matter. First argument then, why debureaucratization makes it easier to help people on the ground. And I want to frame that especially within disaster-prone countries, the time between disasters is incredibly short. Therefore, there's an inherent urgency for what we can do for people, which means that perhaps there is a typhoon this month, but you're going to expect one next week. You're going to expect one in the next 2 months. Or the fact that we don't even know when the next earthquake will happen, but we literally have so many fault lines that intersect with each other and therefore make all of the Philippines very likely to deal with these kinds of disasters. So first level then, what is the problem with the current bureaucratic system? First of all, it takes a long time. You have to contact multiple offices and wait for each, which oftentimes takes months each. Oftentimes there's a chain where approval for one is a prerequisite to forwarding to another and asking for approval again, which means that it makes it far more difficult to get these kinds of things off the ground and the kind of infrastructure projects that might take time in the first place. But also it looks like backlog because you have multiple disasters in a year, and the fact that we have to deal with earthquakes, tsunamis, typhoons, that are all different ways in which we are affected. But the third thing is, what if these people we try to ask help from or decisions from are also people affected? And I think one very good illustration of this is what happened in Cebu after Typhoon Odette. Insofar as the relief goods that people were trying to send and land in Cebu could not land simply because they had to ask from multiple offices to allow planes and other aircraft to land, because even if the main guy who can decide on the safety of the runway was able to approve it, we had to wait for many other offices for the sheer sake of bureaucracy. What does this mean for individuals? That means more people starving in times in which people had to literally line up every single day to get a drop of water. You are allowing those people to die, to get sick, and for all of these people to therefore be more desperate and destitute. The comparative is simple. We streamline the process where you can gain approval from multiple in the same time, or even just inherently ask more offices. So the margin of change is getting infrastructure things done or making crucial decisions hours more quickly, which can change the lives of people. Insofar as less people die, less people have life-changing diseases or life-changing injuries that they have to live with for the rest of their life. These are all large changes for individuals we think are worth it. The second thing is, we would say it's easy to skirt accountability because many offices are involved in their world. You could blame the office of the president or the governor or like the mayor or PhilVox or Pag-asa, but notably, there is no concentrated scrutiny for who you can blame. And what this means is many of these offices for every single subsequent disaster play ping pong with who is therefore responsible possible, and therefore do not really get the real flack of people actually dying. What do we do to solve in our world? One, reducing the number of actors involved forces them to act more in accordance with public good because there are less available scapegoats. Third level, politics. There are more touch points in their world and therefore more opportunities for corruption because there are more people who can affect this. More and more therefore taken out of the budget, for example, and more time overall. Or that these opportunities are actively slowed down for electoral incentives because their positions are naturally part of the chain. For example, Rojas stopping relief goods getting to Yolanda victims in Visayas because he wanted to slap his name across them for electoral incentives. What all of this shows is there are inherent incentives through which politicians, through this bureaucracy, oftentimes stop things for their own benefit because they believe that it is their name that is more important than the things that are happening. But third, on innovation, when there are more politicians, it's just harder to enact innovative things because they would rather have things that are accessory that look good. Things like food, things like, for example, relief goods after the fact, but not actual preventative infrastructure development that would make sure that people are not harmed in the first place, versus us, where it is going to be far more streamlined, in which you don't have to beg all of these politicians to do this. It's only people who are more directly involved, and therefore you have more willingness to do things that are innovative and more effective. Before I just weigh this argument, POI.
So at this point in time, you have not explained what type of processes are likely to be cut down as a result of the streamlining.
So I think it's just like anything that is not directly related. So if, for example, it is about LGUs deciding whether or not to build certain infrastructure, that is fine. But if, for example, larger people or national governments outside of, for example, Cebu or Davao or wherever else are not directly involved in it, we would no longer be asking for their approval in times in which it is necessary. Second level of this then, why will it be done well in our side? One, you reduce politicking, aka having to promise favors to get these things signed or making more concessions. Two, you have stronger scrutiny for failures and therefore more electoral incentives there for them to care about these kinds of things. But even if it's not the best infrastructure, why is it still better than the op comparative? First of all, especially in places close to the coast, you can buy them more time. Second, the severity of one disaster often leads to another, like for example what we've seen in the nuclear meltdown in Fukushima, where the earthquake led to that. But finally, human lives and suffering just cannot be taken back. Yes, death, but also all the damage of personal property or the costs individual people have to bear, even if governments try to give you food. And what this therefore means for individuals is, at the point in which governments take extra months and extra time to prevent these things, all of these Filipinos suffer time and time again as more and more disasters hurt us.
Thank you, Prime Minister. To open up the case for opposition bench, Leader of Opposition.
Hi, am I visible and audible?
Hello, you're both.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Think about the politicians that lied to you with promises of greatness. And look how government repeats the same kinds of narratives. We will streamline the process. We will make it faster for you to get dams that you need. And what have we seen in the Philippines is constant corruption, constant failure. The reason why bureaucracy is important is because it's checks and balances to get expertise that you need to get quality products. And this is the first thing I want to launch into. I want to talk about what these projects really are, because they get it wrong. It is not relief goods. Like, guys, if you read the motion, it says mitigation of infrastructure projects. It is not water bottles. It is things like dams. It is things like seawalls. It is things that take long-term time and effort to create, to mitigate the impacts of a harm, right? It isn't that you can mitigate the impacts by just suddenly going there. That's not the debate, right? It's not about relief projects. But I think what it's actually about is things that are innovative, right? New things that you have to test. Because presumably, if it's another dam that has already been proven in other places, then that will likely get passed faster. It's on different extents, right? But what you have to go through bureaucratic processes for the most is things that are contestable, whether or not this is actually going to work. And we think that validation process is exemplar, is important, because you don't know if those things are going to work. I want to then talk about the second response, right? How they're running just basically the wrong policy. If you look at their narrative, if you look at their policy, it's that you are going to get rid of industries directly linked What does that mean, right? Obviously, the motion isn't that if I want to build a dam, I'm going to call up the history department, right? It means that I'm going to call up the risk management department. And I think what actually happens, because they have no fiat, right? This is a this has preferred motion. You actually have to defer to what the real world wants. And what the real world is that the people who want to cut down times and cut down on bureaucracy the most are not Pag-asa, are not the policies that you actually, the people who are researching, because they're the ones asking for more time. They're the ones asking for, we have to be careful. The
POI.
people who want to make it faster are the politicians who want to gain the benefit from it because their term is about to end. This is also why their claim on, oh, you have less people, therefore you're going to feel more scrutiny on them. If it's just me and some other guy, I'm going to get ousted out of my seat. But the reason why you can't call those people out is because you got rid of those departments that call you out. You got rid of those systems of accountability. I want to talk about setup. 3 things. Firstly, the status quo is that you have checks and balances. And I want to explain why this is important. Because you don't just have politicians checking, right? Just local governments. You actually have the experts behind it. You need, for example, the DRRM to make sure that you abide by building codes. You need to make sure that you abide by risk management codes. If you're actually going to scientifically be able to do this, you need to be able to go through local offices to know whether or not people are going to participate in the project, if they're not going to literally destroy the dam that you build. You need to go to talk to the companies behind the PPPs because you need to know the materials, if they're going to actually work, if they're not just going to fall apart after one earthquake. You need to have security because these are important processes to make sure that they're guarded and they're not going to be destroyed immediately. And I want to talk about what they do on their side. When you have less
POI.
to check and validate, you leave it to the whims of the individuals left behind, the whims of the government officials pushing for these same kinds of policies in the status quo. I have 2 arguments then. But before that, I'll take a POI.
So, if government agencies are corrupt, your solution to reducing that corruption is allowing more government agencies to play a part in this decision-making process?
Yeah, so what? Government industries are not, that's not the claim, right? I'm saying Pag-asa is the one holding politicians accountable. Don't twist the words by saying everyone is corrupt. I have 2 arguments. Firstly, why do you create quality and effective policies on our side? There are 2 reasons why you need bureaucracy. 1, because these mitigation strategies inherently are uncertain, especially for ones that might take the most time, which is their worst case for us, right? Those kinds of seawalls need to be debated because you're not sure if the materials are going to work, if you need a seawall, or if you need other things like climate mitigation strategies like planting more trees or things like that. You need to have it backed by data because these things you're unsure if they're going to work. On their side, they just pass because people want innovative projects fast. But the second thing is that just inherently, these mitigation strategies are complex. If one part fails, everything else fails. If local governments do not agree and people on the ground do not participate, they will protest against your dam and not allow it to work. If you don't have money and it isn't in the budget, you collapse the project from the 2 years it's being built. I want to talk about then why quality is more important than getting it done fast. Number 1, because any failure at all, if your dam does not work, that's the reason why in the Philippines, even if they could be beneficial sometimes, it's just completely opposed by the public. Because the failure is sensationalized to the extent that people are completely against it. Even if it is possibly good for them, it means that you're unlikely to get this kind of change in the future. Secondly, because any failure is deadly. I don't want to hear people saying that, oh, it's okay if we have to get this done fast, right? Let's talk about this in reality. Sure, maybe there's an earthquake in the time that passes between building a shock-proof building. But on their side, you make people move into the building. You make people grow communities around it. And when the next earthquake comes, everybody literally dies because that entire building collapses. That kind of bloodshed, that kind of destruction is not existent on our side because we take the time to build the bridge properly. We take the time to build it up from the ground properly. I have the second argument now. Why do you corrupt institutions? There are 2 reasons why it leads to corruption. Because I think there are incentives on both sides probably to be corrupt, but the capacity to be corrupt is different. On both sides, number 1, you want to frame things as disaster resilient. So you want to propose lots and lots of plans. That means there's an influx of things like the plans to be able to build seawalls or plans to be able to like end disasters into the DRRM, right? It's politically popular. But also, secondly, people want to do it fast because they want to get credit for it. Obviously, they don't want the next person to take credit, especially if it's not someone that they support in their political party. What then happens on their side? 2 things. 1, there are less barriers to check and balance because you have to get it past all the offices, right? That means that there are less chances that you have to like talk to each individual here, tell them that I want to take the money. If you enter into this bargain with me, I can also give you more money. There's just so much more on the line because you have to get through all those officials. Versus on our side, where you have versus on their side, where even if people aren't inherently evil, right, and don't want to take the money, it's just that those two people, it isn't their job to correct each other. It isn't their job to evaluate because you've had that person fired, or they're just less people to actually have a job to hold you accountable. But the second is in terms of public scrutiny. It's that it's impossible to do things like have discussions because at first people are going to really, really hype up the project. Only on our side, when you have more time to take it to build, people are going to start discussing whether or not it's a good thing. People are going to see the transparent records. Versus on your side, when you do not have them published, on their side, there's a massive loophole for corrupt activities. Like even in the Philippines, when you have the Senate, which is the most public thing ever, you still had the pork barrel scandal. Imagine if this existed on local level governments, how much more corrupt activities we would have on their side. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, and that's why government absolutely loses.
Thank you, Leader of Opposition. To extend the case for government bench, Deputy Prime Minister.
I presume I'm audible and visible.
Hello, yes, you're both.
Okay. So, POIs in chat, I'll take you before 6. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The natural way op team loses is that they assume that the only bureaucracy that exists is the one that's convenient for their case. They say it's the only expert monitoring all of these assessments without at all considering the context of these real world things like that happened in Haiti, in Bangladesh, and in Turkey, where they are developing countries with massive amounts of bureaucracy, slow response times, and many people dying in these instances. They cannot just cherry pick examples and say, this is the only good stuff we can do because they have to debate status quo on their side of the house and they have not defended it yet from Kara. I'm not sure why this case is asserting this to be true. I'll do a couple of responses first. The first thing they say is they will these projects require lots of time. Therefore, on our side of the house, we won't expend time on these things and do them badly. Firstly, they don't explain the delta on their side of the house for what changes in clearly time-sensitive things that often get bogged down in massive amounts of bureaucracy that require lots and lots of approvals on their side of the house and lots of disbursement being delayed. It's things like shelters, mangrove plantation, quick retrofitting of vulnerable buildings or coastal infrastructure, especially when the typhoon is literally 2 days away or is already there. They don't explain why these people get benefit on their side of the house other than simply saying, well, the status quo is good. But the status quo is clearly failing on your side of the house when many of these people are dying, many of these people have distrust in the government and often don't get the funds that they need in the short term. So we clearly win on those people already.
Fine.
But secondly, let's assume it takes, I'll take the PY in chat by the way, Alex. Let's assume it takes long, like long-term shelters on your side of the house, right? Let's assume this in the best case and most charitable. We are obviously building the same things on either side. Also, there are incentives for governments to build long-term infrastructure because it limits costs. It's also very, very good for particular administrations. This is not something within their side of the house. What is the nuance? The nuance is that we remove approval processes that often add 2 to 3 years as bloat on their side of the house, even for these long-term shelters, which is why maybe in the short term, the taxpayers that might have paid for it, but don't get the benefits from it because they've already experienced the flood. It's already too late on your side of the house. They have not explained why these don't cut under the swab of debureaucratization. The second thing they say is, we will not do this well. We will just massively do stupid things like remove basic risk management, etc. when we do debureaucratization. Firstly, we explain literally this isn't true. It is a straw man of our case. One, what we explain is that you remove massive bureaucracy and tangling. They want to use the Philippines as an example. It's the NDRRMC and the DSWD, often conflicting massively in instances of environmental and especially earthquake disasters. It's the fact that you don't know who to go to, and the offices themselves are often skirting each other and wanting to not be accountable for particular bad instances, which is why they act slowly. Secondly, it's long-term approvals and disbursements that Nessie explains. It's the fact that they don't have the funds to build these things and often cannot build these things unless multiple different offices on on top of them approve these processes significantly, often because it's so expensive as well, and often is just the culture within that country. There are various ways in which you explain, so even if you don't believe that, this will be done at a baseline level good. We structurally prove this, they assert it won't be done good. Here are 3 structural reasons why it will be done well. Firstly, there are mandatory essential checks anyways. This is literally legally true. Like, just for example, like auditing of basic buildings, right? Structural integrity checks by engineers. Engineering companies want to do this because they obviously don't want to break the law in not doing this. So obviously we will not do the stupid kinds of things that they say, like remove basic risk management. 2, there are natural levels of political accountability that Kara literally says exists, and scrutiny for these things. So obviously you won't build like terrible buildings will like completely crumble in the short term. Obviously you have some incentive to maintain some degree of bureaucracy, but remove the ones that cause people to die in the like very, very short term. But 3, governments don't want to remove basic level things that are very, very important because this is clearly bad politically for them. They have a natural electoral incentive to avoid extreme extents of this to the point of idiocy, as they accuse us on our side of the house, because they don't want to be removed from that particular position and be blamed for that, which is why they will do bureaucratization, but they will do it in a good way. There are 3 structural reasons. They just assert it from Kara and they cannot win the debate from them. They then say corruption is worse. I want to be very clear in flipping corruption. Number 1, they say they want credit for it. These politicians might have credit on either side. The difference is that when you want credit for it and you build a fast building, but it eventually like destroys, etc., these people will be put out of office anyways on either side of the house. The difference is that we don't make it so that there's one particular politician that stands out and saying, I want to remove the processes, and yet does it badly. We have the entire government supporting you and streamlining the processes, which is why it's far more likely to be better. We gave you explanations for why corruption is worse. It's worse on their side and better on our side. 1, we lessen the touch points of corruption. Every single bureaucratic level is money siphoned of the top. Costs that accrue from things like bureaucratic overhead, which means that the amount of buildings you can build, the amount of people that you can save in the infrastructure project is simply less. Number 2, often the crediting thing gets worse on your side of the house because different administrative agencies, if there are good instances of like disaster response, can claim for that, but they can also, in instances where it's bad, not claim accountability, which is why they can shirt off things like, like skimming up the top and budgets, etc. Which is why corruption is worse. Corruption is important on their side of the house because 1, the amount of money that they have is simply less, but 2, it's just the fact that people don't have public trust. This is my extension. Before I go into the extension, I'll take up your why.
So again, same question with Nessie. If we have streamlining, given all of the incentives for politicians to appeal to short-term political cycles, what's likely to be cut down on your side?
I explained this, Alex. It's the basic bureaucratic approval processes that often add bloat. But we also have incentives to have essential checks, which, by the way, exist because we have common sense, right? Governments don't want them to be elected out every single time there's a disaster. They don't want to break the law for these kinds of companies, which is why we will not do remove basic risk management. We will remove approvals and we will like bloated approvals and remove bloated the bureaucracy. Second extension then. Why is it important that we have people trusting the government in these instances, and why do we have more public trust? Why do we have more public trust? Firstly, we're just more likely to feel when there's less bureaucracy that these things arrive on time as people on the ground, which means that you get things like infrastructure projects, like storm shelters, etc., being built when you need it. Number 2, you just feel as if there's less bureaucracy. You know which politicians, for example, helped you, and you know that, for example, it's not a very, very high process for everyone like to go there. It doesn't take a very long period of time. Number 3, you know that they arrived there earlier, which is why there's more community engagement. It's the fact that when you arrive earlier or even before a period of disaster, communities can engage and cooperate with the government versus happening after, where people have already left, people have already had their houses and their buildings destroyed. Why is this very, very important? Firstly, it's important that we remove bureaucracy. Bureaucracy in these instances is the main reason for why people cannot live a happy and fulfilled life. If they think that in the times of disaster, their government will not respond to them, that's when they don't start up businesses. That's when they feel unsafe all the time. And they feel as if their government does not represent them, so they don't go out and vote and they don't feel represented. Number 2, they're more likely to cooperate in instances under our side of the house. More community engagement. If you don't think that your entire government is completely corrupt and it's filled with bureaucracy that's useless, that will kill you and fill your family, if they are slow enough not to respond to your needs in that time. This is important because it weighs over everything else in the round. It's about fulfillment and the way in which people engage with their society and that state. For all of these reasons and more, very, very proud to approach.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. To extend the case for opposition bench, Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Hello. Starting in, sorry. POIs via voice. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Go. In 2019, the provinces of Cotabato, Surigao, and Davao del Sur in southern Mindanao experienced a magnitude 7 earthquake and several top magnitude aftershocks that resulted in billions of pesos worth of infrastructure damage, in concrete being torn from roads, and in hundreds of unnecessary casualties due to administrative failure. We do not need to imagine what less bureaucracy in infrastructure projects looks like because we've seen it before. The senior high school building of Vigo City's Coriasu College collapsed brick by brick within 1 year of its construction. This is the kind of destruction that government does not preempt. The first thing I want to note is that this motion is specifically about long-term mitigatory infrastructure projects, which are not immediate and not reactionary. Government's material on getting relief goods immediately to typhoon-stricken areas are not part of the debate. And this is the same response to their material on we need immediate evacuation centers for people to be able to go to. Immediate evacuation centers and emergency evacuation centers in the status quo are things like schools. You do not build them for the purpose of mitigating disasters. What this debate specifically is about creating evacuation shelters that are long-term, creating seawalls that prevent flooding in low-altitude areas, housing that people can move into and know that it won't be torn apart the next time there's a typhoon or there's an earthquake. These are long-term projects, which is why it's important that they are done well. But secondly, I want to do an after analysis in terms of incentive because government attempts to cross the bench and say that, well, we will only remove basic mandatory approval systems. They don't explain what basic mandatory approval systems look like. I want you to read the motion. It is expediting evaluation, minimizing the amount of offices that are involved. Politicians are not the ones that you cut out in the motion because there's already political incentive to create as many visible projects as you can before your term ends. A lot of these politicians are running for re-election, which means that they want to stamp their name on as many buildings as possible, which means that these are not the areas where bureaucracy is likely to take place. The areas where bureaucracy is likely to happen are offices like the DRRM, which determine whether or not these projects are actually mitigatory. Offices like the DPWH, which oversees whether or not the construction is up to building codes. Office like the DOF, which examines whether or not these projects are financially feasible and hold budget hearings to know that there's no corruption involved. And what we explained from Kara is that all of these offices have unique specialties that all contribute to making sure that the project is good. These are the kinds of offices that are likely to ask for more time to approve these projects, which is why government cannot cross the house and say that they will still exist on their side. These are offices that are run by technocrats that aren't swayed by political incentive. They're swayed by their reputation as scientists and as leaders in their industries, and that's why they're likely to be the ones that are most likely to be cut out if you cut out bureaucracy. That is where bureaucracy actually happens. We would suggest these industries are still important. The third thing I want to do is just weigh why effectiveness is so much more important than speed. And this is engaging on government's best case where we assume that these projects are going to be done immediately. There are three things happen when mitigation projects fail. One is that these failures are often sensationalized by the media. It's easy for media narratives to say that the government is wasting money because these mitigation projects are important, yes, but you don't need them until you actually need them. You don't need them or see their use for them until there's a typhoon, until there's an earthquake. And so in the interim, people are able to say that we don't actually want or need these projects. So that is where, when these projects fail, you lose trust in mitigatory projects. That is where people are less likely to advocate for them to be built in the first place. That is the harm that exists exclusively on government side. But secondly, that is a massive waste of resources if these projects fail. Jello says it's very expensive. So we're wasting money on projects that are not actually up to date. But thirdly, people die. And I want to note that regular building codes and infrastructures are bureaucratic in the status quo, that because there's an assumption that when they fail, the failure is catastrophic. It looks like malls in South Korea that collapsed because of one earthquake within just several years of their construction, because of the fact that they do not go through the bureaucratic process of making sure that these buildings are actually legit. You place these projects on top of fault lines, on top of the most dangerous places in the country, and then you say that it's okay to override basic mandatory approval systems with destructive in nature because of the fact
that these projects are likely to be the ones that need to have the most scrutiny. We use this scrutiny for other building and infrastructure projects, but not for the ones that are on the most dangerous and the most prone to destruction. That doesn't make sense. Before I get on to corruption, POI, go.
This is a false dichotomy. Your side has 4 levels of approval. We have 2. At minimum, there's still essential checks and political accountability. You have to defend the status quo where it's delayed. In many instances, people die. So you cannot defend a false dichotomy.
Yeah. So in our world, we have 4 levels of accountability: the DRRM, the DPWH, the DOF, and local governments. You cut 2 of those out, and what happens? Either these buildings fail, corruption happens, or these infrastructure projects are being built in places where people don't actually want them. Like, all of these 4 levels of accountability are important. That's the entire case. Lastly, on corruption, they say that, well, corruption is much more likely if you have more people going through it. No, that's not how it works. What happens when you streamline projects is that you make the work that these offices have to do more general in nature, because again, you only have 2 offices that are approving this, right? So it means that things like building construction, for example, will be relegated to the DRRM. Things like approving budgets will be relegated to local governments. And that is where they can say either one, that we did the bare minimum of our job description, and therefore it's not our fault if corruption happens. That's where you get the ping pong of accountability that Nessie talks about. Or 2, that you get corporations, which are likely the ones that are going to be handling these projects, be able to say that when these projects fail, it's not actually our fault, even if we did not construct them up to the building codes of the time, even if we did not construct them up to standard, it's not our fault, because calamity happens, etc., etc. The government was supposed to approve these things, they approved it, so it's no longer our fault. That is where you get no accountability at all, because of the fact that the actors involved in this project can just say that it's not their job to double check these things, or it's not their job to make sure that this is actually happening. The reason why mitigation projects are so important the reason why bureaucracy is so important for mitigation projects specifically is because these mitigation projects are not only prone to destruction, but the fact that they're prone to destruction means that a lot of people can skirt accountability when destruction does happen. That is why they need to be bureaucratic. That is why people need a solid job description as to what they're supposed to do and what we can hold them accountable for when destruction does happen. That is what happens in calamities. Because government never engages with that, they have to lose.
Thank you, Deputy Leader of Opposition. To finalize the case for government bench, government whip.
Yeah. Okay. I'll be taking POS through voice. Raise it once. I'll remember you, I promise. Okay. So, hold on. I'm just fixing everything, making sure everything is in order. Okay. Speech start in 3, 2, 1. I want to bring in the implicit comparative behind opposition's empty words, which is status quo, a world already riven with disaster and incredible slowness in terms of dealing with these natural disasters. We'd say that even if you believe the vast majority of their cases, and if you 100% believe all of their claims, their best case is literally our worst case. It is status quo and nothing changes. This is what is wrong with building a negative case and banking on false assumptions and lies to build it. The first thing that I want to do is clarify what the burden is. Yes, this is infrastructure, but infrastructure isn't always long-term. This looks like storm shelters or even small things like the seawalls that you're able to create even in the interim. It's things like quick retro fixes to a lot of the buildings that exist within an area because you expect a typhoon to come and expect it to be strong. All of these are arguably still things that affect the creation and the survival rate of people within the nation and don't require years to build. So importantly, they can't just scapegoat this and then frame the debate out by saying, no, this isn't about what happens in the short term, when clearly it is. If they say that it isn't, that's just a plain assertion coming from them. The first thing that I want to talk about is the weighing of speed versus anything else in the round, which they say is quality. But before that, I want to directly deal with the claim that they bring, that quality is traded off because they abandon risk management. And here I want to directly weigh it. If you are a government official, are you likely to act in ways that reflect terribly on you, i.e., by removing these risk management systems and the people who can actually build these buildings? Or are you willing to do it in ways that are good? First, this is plain false, because if you build a storm shelter and it collapses and it kills 200 people, it arguably reflects worse on you than if you just did nothing at all, which means that there are express incentives to ensure that the things that are built are actively being, actually things that will stay afloat and actually not destroy in the time calamity strikes. But importantly, we've already streamlined within society the ways in which we build the vast majority of these things. Like, guys, it's been thousands of years since we first built a building. I'm pretty sure that it won't collapse just because we speed up the notions of bureaucracy that allow it to be built in the first place. It's a plain assertion, and substitutes for analysis aren't likely to be able to fill in there. But secondly, if it's true that Kara says that government officials shave off money from these budgets, and Pag-asa and 5 volts and those government agencies don't, then government officials won't cut out Pag-asa and 5 volts insofar as these are the types of agencies that aren't going to steal the money that they want to corrupt off of. They're likely to block out other government officials who want to do it too. So this looks like larger government offices blocking it out directly from other government officials who may want to take that money because they want to take that money for themselves. So even if you believe their worst case that this is corruption, it's still far better on our side since there's less people who are taking money from the pot. And it also means that Pag-asa and 5 volts, even by their own incentive analysis, aren't going to be blocked out of this process insofar as they are the least likely government agencies to enact corruption and take from that pot in the first place. But here I want to weigh speed versus anything in the round, which is quality. And this is already taking them at their best. 3 weighing metrics. 1, it at least ensures that there's some response and stimulus, and is literally what saves lives and undercuts every single moral and practical claim in the round. Secondly, it's a question of who governments should prioritize and what they should prioritize given the taxpayer money and political power afforded to the government by the people, which means it's a government failing if taxpayers in the present die. Maybe these seawalls, even in their best case, may be built in 5 years regardless, but on their side, it'll take 20 years, 50 years before it will be built because of all the bureaucratic layers that they still have to deal with. Even in that interim, we'd still say that it's far better under our side. The problem with their side is that it takes far too long, which means it's a principled government failing if taxpayers in the present die, if they choose to prioritize those in the future, so they can pivot to that in opposition with. But the third weighing metric is the fact that long-term projects aren't exactly what people need in these scenarios. Sometimes you just need to give them time to leave the province to ensure that they're safe at the time at which the typhoon is directly over them, insofar as they have the opportunity to leave or migrate to another place in the instance that it actually does hit. We'd explained that shelters to keep them safe in the typhoon, or the opportunity and optionality of staying safe within, that is only made possible because of quick time infrastructure that has to be rebuilt every single time, insofar as it necessarily happens in places where disasters are already prone, are already opportunities and ways and benefits that they don't contend with beyond what they explain. So the axis of this debate isn't just on what they say, it's about all of the things that Nessie explains that are totally unresponded at this point. The second thing that I want to, so this is immediately debate winning, right? Since it takes them at their best, and explains why their best case framing doesn't work and actually flips to our side. I'll take a POI before I go on.
Okay, so this shift at GovVip is crazy, but let's assume that you're correct. If it's easier to build short-term projects because we don't debureaucratize the long-term ones, then isn't that a good thing?
No. So that's exactly what we're saying. It's easier to build the short-term projects and the long-term projects as well. So also, this isn't a case shift. Clearly, you weren't listening. The second thing that I want to talk about is corruption. And here I want to directly weigh the ways in which we deal with corruption under their side. And the big thing here is accountability. And it's important what Nessie here says, that it is impossible in status quo to pin the blame and say, no, it wasn't my fault, it was this other government agency's fault. Or it's harder to scrutinize them and ensure that corruption isn't happening when it exists beyond a wide variance of different government agencies. This changes at the point at which you streamline the vast majority of these things. When you ensure that it's a smaller amount of government agencies, which means that audits and all the like are much easier to enact and far more persuasive. It's easier to scrutinize these government agencies to prevent corruption in the first place, which is an actual mechanism instead of reasserting some other example in order to try and prove a claim. But secondly, it's also about their laziness. The fact that it's harder under their side to be able to do things like pin the blame on a certain thing, that you didn't do your job well enough and therefore these people died. Insofar it's spread across a net of government officials, which means that no tangible change from protests will actually actually come to exist. So obviously on corruption, opposition has conclusively lost this debate. The last thing that I want to talk about is the unresponded claim that came from both Nessie and Jello, that actually, beyond that, it's about how people feel within governance and what they're doing. The response coming from Chelsea was to say, oh no, but people see this as unnecessary government expenditures because it's sensationalized by a media. In a disaster-prone country where these things literally happen all the fucking time. Are you serious? The reason why this is important is because the ways in which people interact with their government are incredibly chronocentric. That is to say that they value their government actually doing things that can tangibly be seen, which is why it's important that they feel like confidence oozing from the government at this point, since it's a prerequisite to things like operation, it's a prerequisite to things like cooperation, and it's the prerequisite for them having trust in the government in the first place, not have to fend for their lives in general. For all these reasons, we went on every conceivable moral claim and practical claim. So for these reasons, we propose.
Thank you, Government Whip. To finalize the case for opposition bench, opposition whip.
Hello. Can I check if I'm both audible and visible?
Hello, confirming that you're both.
Okay. Give me a second. I'll just like POIs through chat, please. Okay. Speech start in 3, 2, 1. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. There are two issues that I'll have in my speech. First is on quality, and second is on accountability. But I want to make two large call outs here. The first is I think government bench down the line conflates long-term and short-term projects. This debate is not about immediate typhoon relief, which on either side of the house, we don't support it being heavily bureaucratized, like people should get food, people should get water. This is about communities where we ask people to not just stay for 2 years, but to build intergenerations, people who were traumatized by large typhoons and earthquakes, be told that they're able to rebuild their lives for the better. But secondly, I want to point out, right, like the bureaucratization is inherently lessening the processes. What differs them from regular projects is that these types of mitigation projects are more complex. They require different planning. They have more jargon and require more expertise because they have a specific nuance of being able to mitigate the worst extents of natural disasters. That's why like government bench can't just get away with saying that you still have basic mandatory checks because these are not basic buildings that are in the middle of Katipunan. These are buildings that you build on top of wall lines, on places where there are flash floods and the capacity for you to literally be submerged 10 feet over and be expected to still have building capacity then. The first issue then is on quality. And I want to explain that at worst, right, it's bad. But if it gets worse on side government bench, then we already win in debate. But I want to answer this issue in two questions. The first is, what is likely to be caught by the streamlining? And as we've proven down the bench, and they don't respond to this, it's not politicians who benefit from, one, not holding budget hearings because that detects inflated expenses and allows them to get away with the skimming that Jello talks about in the speech. It's not the fast approval. They benefit from the fast approval because they want to appeal to the electorate in the next cycle of election. The streamlining specifically will impact those that actually care about the quality and the time to make sure the rigor of the project is true. People like Philbox, DRRM, that are run by technocrats that value research and trials, testing, and peer review because their reputation is not reliant on short electoral cycles, but their credibility within the scientific community and the fields of mitigatory and risk management. These are the bureaucracies that matter the most. And that's why the POI down the bench coming from you is very important. They don't respond to that. They can't respond to that from Nessie. Why is it that basic mandatory checks is not enough? Firstly, as I've explained in my intro, that you can't, and as Chelsea explained in her responses, you place them in high-risk areas. You expose them in the not just repeated disasters, but the strongest of disasters like floods and earthquakes. Secondly, they house millions of people and you signal them to be safe. The comparative on our side is that even if there's less of these projects, at least like we don't tell people that it's okay to go into these high-risk areas because the buildings there are safe, right? But lastly is that these people are not just regular individuals. They're people relocated to already existent or past calamities. They've already been vulnerable and traumatized. We don't want to traumatize them even further, and that's why it's not worth the trade-off. The second thing is, even if it takes long, and this is the the qualm of most government bench, right? I want to ask, what type of projects will be affected most by the bureaucracy? Like Sam says, there are some projects that will last 50 years, which is asserted, right? We explain that projects that are already successful and are proven in the past, things like mangrove forest retrofitting, which is done and tested year by year anyway, and have a record, will get fast approval anyway because they've been repeated, because they've been proven, because there is no controversy and no reason for any politician to just stall their approval anyway. It's those that are speculative, or it's those that demand so much government funds that are likely to take 10 to 20 years. And why is this okay for these types of projects to be stalled, right? Firstly, we explained that these projects will demand certain costs, and governments concedes to that, but their benefits are speculative. So we're okay with deprioritizing them. But secondly, exactly, I want to flip the impact that comes from DPM and GovIP. We want to prioritize projects that already provide value for the most amounts of people. And therefore, the reaction of most offices and the reaction of most departments is to prioritize projects if it's true that they appeal to short-term election cycles that are more easily approved. And those just happen to be projects and proposals that have more data, that are more assured. And that's where we get most of the benefits. Even if the trade-off is possibly a large like dam or seawall, like a seawall that potentially can win millions of save millions of people. Exactly. We shouldn't look at potential when it's actual lives on the line and money that is thrown down the drain. Before that, POI.
You cannot build the analysis for why the important and urgent disaster seawalls and retrofitting can happen on your side from WIP. You had to explain it from the first two speakers. We explained it's unlikely on your side because if you say quality checks, there are still quality checks which bloat these things to 2 to 3 years past when they're needed.
No, you're just not listening to Kara. Kara tells you in framing, right? What are these types of bureaucracy likely to be? It's things like data, it's things like trials, right? So if you already have a record, you don't have to do the trials as much. And we also said it coming from Chelsea, like the type of projects that are like not controversial will likely pass to begin with. Like the ones that are controversial are probably those that have information that people find sketchy, or some politicians or some local communities or some experts disagree with for whatever reason. And that's why it's okay if these projects do get stalled for several years on your side of the bench, compared to risking these projects and the lives of people as well. So we already win in terms of quality. The second thing then is accountability. And three things that I want to address here. Firstly is that apparently there is just more money, and that means more money skimmed. One, this is symmetric. As Jello said, it is inherently expensive. And as we explained, because these are not regular infrastructure projects, they're projects specifically to address mitigation on natural disasters, they will be expensive. The question then is, where can we scrutinize them more? And that's where, and we have more budget hearings. That's when we have more time and more approvals, because if ever one office is compromised, that means the other offices can hold them in check. But secondly, even if you don't believe this, it's involvement from the public, which was already in the first argument, not addressed by Deputy and GovIP at all, so you have to credit this. It's the fact that the public interest groups
Hello, did the speaker get frozen or just on my end? Okay.
Yeah, on our end too.
Hello, I'm so sorry. Can I ask what like my God, that's
Hello.
yeah, can I ask
So,
around what time I was stopped and like what
we,
was the last thing heard?
yep, you stopped at 6 minutes and 25 seconds. The last thing that you were going to do is to explain why winning quality is important.
Okay, so I was not in my second issue on accountability yet.
Yep, already.
Sorry.
You're already on that. Uh, okay, so
Sorry.
the last thing on my notes is that you're concluding why winning quality is important. So I don't think you're able to conclude yet the second thing.
Okay. All right. Sorry, can I get the exact words if that's okay?
Sure. So hold on. Okay, so you're here at what is likely to take long are the innovative proposals, etc., etc. And then there are a few things, few demonstrations here that I did not take note of.
Okay. All right. 6:25, so that's 40, so mga around 1 minute. Okay, thank you. Okay, speech start continuing in 3, 2, 1. So yes, the type of projects that take the longest ones are those that are speculative or demand so much funds. And in that case, we're okay with trading it off. And it's where the flip happens, right? Because number one, these are the types of projects that have certain costs, but then their return is oftentimes very speculative. But secondly, if as Deputy Prime Minister and Government wants to have, we want to provide projects that actually certain value and benefit people, then that's how we change the incentives of governments, departments to prioritize projects that actually have shown results compared to those that are speculative but are more grandstanding because they're going to be affected by the bureaucracy. Lastly, then is on accountability. The first thing is on giving more money. This is symmetric because these projects are expensive, right? That means what matters more is where we can scrutinize it. And that's why we need budget hearings. That's why we need several offices that will call you out of self-interest. Secondly, if you don't believe that because developing governments have corrupt offices, that means that we need more involvement from the public. And that's where they're more likely to be involved when there's time, when the initial clamor dies down and they're more likely to scrutinize the project. Lastly, some politicking. One, when there's several people, you're incentivized to act because you don't have a monopoly and you can't be beaten out. And you haven't incentive to expose each other. Weigh this off. Maybe on their side, it's easier to fault someone, but inherently, right, you will make mistakes because either you have less time or you just have limited experience because someone from DPWH can't be the DRRM and the DOA and the local government at the same time. So at the end of the speech, right, we went on several fronts. First, on quality. Second, even if you don't win on quality, we explain why accountability is better. And lastly, we were able to engage on both the best case and the worst case where there are some speculative innovation that we have, but we think that actual lives matter more than things that we don't know for sure will work. For all those reasons and more, side with optics.
Thank you, Opposition Whip. Last remarks from Opposition Bench, Opposition Reply.
Don't worry.
Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Go. I want you to look at your notes and look for government's illustration of the model because across all three speakers, they never take the trade-off and tell you what debureaucracy actually looks like. In the motion, it explains that it is expediting evaluation, minimizing and cutting out the number of offices that are involved. The only thing that they say if they remove quote-unquote basic mandatory approval, and what we explained from Kara, is that this basic mandatory approval is incredibly important. You can't cut out LGUs because they're the ones that talk to their constituents to make sure that these projects are being built in the right places and they're not displacing a lot of people. You can't cut off the Department of Finance because these are people that audit the outflow of funds, which means that less corruption is involved. On our side, the the way that I'm going to go through this reply then is I'm going to go through all of government's claims and tell you all of opposition's responses down the bench to take them down. The first thing I'm going to explain is on corruption. They say that corruption is easier to flag out if there are only 2 people or like less people working on the project. But this assumes that we're able to call people out. And what we explain is 3 things. 1, it's the lack of time and transparency that makes corruption harder to call out. You can't call out corruption or effectivity if the project was already built. interest groups, for example, cannot look at the project and determine whether or not it's good for people if the project is already being built because you streamline all of these processes. But two, we flipped accountability. So if you are going to cut out certain offices and make roles more general, these offices can then claim that when destruction happens, that they're not specialized in these areas. They're not specialized in construction or disaster management. It's not their job to check these things, and that is where we get that is where we get mistakes in the building and in the management of these institutions. But thirdly, it's the fact that because there are less people scrutinizing these projects, and we specifically frame that the contractors that are likely to fund and manage these projects are going to be able to claim that, well, if my disaster shelter or if my seawall broke down, it's because of the calamity and not because I was taking money from off the top, or not because I was skimping on materials, for example, to make sure that I made more profit. So these are the kinds of things that make corruption more likely on their end. They never responded to any of these claims, and therefore they have to lose on corruption. The second thing we ask them is, who is actually likely to be cut out in these scenarios? They say that in the status quo, there are quality checks and politicking that bloat these projects to being delayed for 2 years, 10 years, 50 years. We engage on these two frames. The first on politicking. We said that there are already political incentives for politicians to make sure that these projects are out in the time that they're being during their term, so they can stamp their names on the buildings. So it's not likely that the bureaucracy that they're going to cut out is going to happen on the side of these politicians. We ask them then why projects are actually likely to take up more time. And this is where we engage on the second frame on quality checks. We said that the offices that are likely to take up bureaucracy and take up more time in implementing these projects are offices like the DPWH, offices like the DRRM, offices like Pag-asa that are likely to ask for more time to be able to evaluate these projects. Sure, they can still check these projects on government side, but they only get 2 days, 3 days to be able to review the papers. We say that that's not enough. And because government never actually trades anything off in this debate, they also have to lose on this issue. But lastly, they say that quality is not always important, like long-term shit is not always important. Sorry, because people need infrastructure projects. Now, this is simply unengaging because we gave you 3 reasons why failure is so destructive when it comes to calamity projects. One, that these failures are often sensationalized by the media, so you lose trust in mitigatory projects. You're less likely to be able to do them in the future. Secondly, it's a massive waste of resources. If Jello says it's expensive, then that expense is just gone on their side. But thirdly, it's the fact that people die. When these shelters collapse, when these seawalls break down, there are people under them. That is why it's so harmful, because when these projects die, you as the state have said that it's okay to move your family there. It's okay to move your livelihood there. And when these projects collapse, that is a massive violation of trust by the state, and that is why we have to do them well. For all those reasons, opposing.
Thank you, opposition reply. For the final remarks from government reply.
Hi. I assume I'm audible and visible?
Hello? Yes, you're both.
Okay, great. Don't let this team lie to you. We tell you what we cut out. And I'm sorry if we can't give an exhaustive list because different projects require different streamlined things. But broadly, if it is true that, for example, the DOF or whatever else office is crucial, we are willing to keep it. What we want to remove are things that are unnecessary, long-taking disbursements, having to go all the way up to the chain to Malacanang to approve a seawall in Cebu. These are the kinds of things that change people's lives. And fine, maybe you don't give every single instance, but it's unreasonable for that to happen. But we would suggest as well that UpWhip is building. She explains that projects like transplanting mangroves to strengthen soil will always be prioritized because they're seen as important. Again, it's building at WHIP, but second, this is asserted in comparison to all the clear analysis from PM, which specifically explains why you need this to be done. UpBlock, in fact, pivots to public accountability. By rules of debate, we have no constructive speaker to respond to this. You should not credit this, but it is proven in PM, but they don't respond or weigh against it. So you have to defer to what is standing material for first, which is PM, which we would suggest is far better in being proven and analyzed. So I'm going to explain why their case is indefensible and why it actually flips to work in our favor. They claim at Cara that the incentive for corruption is wanting to frame it as disaster resilience because it's politically popular. But she also explains in defense of quality that failure is deadly and will become sensationalized to the extent that the public will be heavily against this. What this illustrates is how self-interested politicians are moderated, insofar as, yes, they want it to be done fast, but they also have electoral incentives, so the risk of sensationalization means that they will assure some baseline quality and make sure it's not purely accessory because, as they explain, it is politically popular. But second, this also undermines the large part of Chelsea's extension that explains that there is less scrutiny because the government already approved it, which is that if it is true coming from C that there is government approval means people will not care about it, then the harms that Cara explains does not exist. But listen, you have to believe the first speaker, which means that you cannot believe a large chunk of what Chelsea says because it contradicts Cara. What this therefore means is, the conclusion is simple. What Cara says might be true, but the truth value is not enough. These mechanisms, real life, interact with each other in a way that effectively prove why it works for us and why streamlined processes still have some degree of accountability that we already prove at PM without direct response. Second, on corruption, they counter assert that corruption will happen, but we build 3 reasons at PM that they don't directly respond to. In fact, if you look at our analysis, it is unclear why this corruption is removed just because there are more people involved, because the success of their claim relies on the assumption that politicians will not collaborate on corruption, which they don't actually prove. And they also agree that politicians are naturally corrupt, which means that they don't actually prove why things are likely to happen in the way that they do. We clearly win analytically, but if you don't believe that, let's directly weigh quality versus speed. I want you to take note of the frame. This is about disaster-prone countries. Metro Manila floods every other week. Visayas becomes post-apocalyptic because of big typhoons every few years, and Mindanao experiences an earthquake every month. And in that period, you have small businesses who are the sole sources of income for low-income families that have to close, and therefore these people have no money to repair their homes or pay for food. People experience food and water shortages as they are cut off from supply lines because infrastructure to be blocks roads, which is what happened in Cebu, or that children living on the coast simultaneously scream for their lives and drown. They cannot tell us we have the ability to wait, because while all of those plans sit in the office of a politician, people are literally dying. And I'm sorry that might not be the reality for a lot of people, but we would suggest that's a reality for the vast majority of the Filipinos, people in Haiti, etc., etc. So yes, we would suggest our worst case is still better than their best case, because our worst case, in the event that these structures fail, that is something that is literally the same as these plans being good but not being implemented, and therefore not being able to save the lives that they want to save. Maybe you scrutinize every single detail, but in that period, you have more and more lives that are lost. It is quite simple. Regardless of whether or not our infrastructure collapses after one typhoon, we can keep more people alive. We can build more seawalls if it fails, but we cannot bring the dead back.
Thank you, government reply. For the debaters, it would be best if you just stay here. And then for the, I think I have one panelist. Let's proceed to the Discord deliberation. Thank you, guys.
Ross, thank
Oh,
you for the
you may
round.
close the
Thank you
house.
for judging us.
Thank you.